I used to sit by the window and wait for his texts, holding my breath like a child waiting for permission to feel loved. He always made me feel like I was too much, too loud, too emotional to be wanted by anyone sane. Every time I cried, he rolled his eyes and muttered something like, "Here we go again," as if my pain was just another episode of some exhausting show. He called my tears manipulation, like I was playing a cruel game he didn't sign up for. And yet, I stayed. For years, I stayed, because he convinced me no one else would ever want a girl like me. He never hit me, and that made everything harder to explain to people who didn't understand the violence of silence. It was in his words, his absences, the way he'd disappear for days and come back smelling like lies, but looking me in the eye like he owed no answers. He brought me flowers that felt like bribes, not apologies, wrapped in guilt and tied with false hope. He knew exactly how to keep me clinging, just enough sweetness to numb the poison, just enough charm to blur the bruises he left on my soul, just enough to make me doubt my own reality. The worst part wasn't the pain. It was the confusion. I started wondering if maybe I was broken, if I was too sensitive, too insecure, too everything. I reread our old texts like sacred scripture, searching for the moment I stopped being lovable. My friends stopped asking about him, stopped reminding me of my worth, because they knew I'd defend him with the passion of a lost cause. I kept telling myself, he's just going through a hard time. He'll come around. But he always had a reason for hurting me, and I always had an excuse ready to protect him. I remember the night I cried in the shower for 3 hours, while the water ran cold and the light flickered like it was mourning with me. He was out again, ignoring every message I sent. Not because he was busy, but because he wanted me to feel the ache of being invisible. When he finally got home, I told him I felt like a ghost in my own life. He didn't even look at me, just shrugged and said, "You're always crying. What's new?" That broke something inside me, something delicate, human, and irretrievable. But I still wasn't ready to walk away. Not yet. He made me believe that needing love made me weak, that if I were stronger, I'd stop asking for more than the crumbs he tossed my way. So I started shrinking myself, my voice, my needs, my joy, until I was small enough to avoid being a burden. I stopped talking unless spoken to, stopped laughing unless he approved, stopped feeling unless I could hide it. I became silent enough to survive his storms without making waves. But one day, the silence inside me grew louder than his voice. And that was the beginning of the end, even if I didn't see it yet. The idea didn't come like thunder. It came like a whisper in the dark. What if I disappeared? Not forever, just long enough to remember how it felt to breathe without fear. Just long enough for him to wonder where I went, maybe even miss the girl he buried under years of control. But the more I thought about it, the more it stopped sounding like fantasy and started sounding like freedom. I didn't want revenge. I didn't want drama. I just wanted peace, and I knew he'd never let me leave without breaking me one last time. I started planning in silence, like a prisoner digging a tunnel no one could see. I deleted my social media, one app at a time, so no one would notice the pattern. I began hiding money in old books and makeup bags, little bills folded like secrets. Every night, I made lists of what I needed, not for comfort, but for survival. I practiced lying to my reflection in the mirror. I'm fine, just going away for a bit. And slowly, my fear turned into resolve, the kind of quiet power that grows when there's nothing left to lose. I booked a bus ticket under a fake name to a place neither of us had ever mentioned, a town with no ties, no memories, and no history to haunt me. I didn't tell anyone, because if even one person knew, the secret could die. I studied the map like it was a treasure, and memorized the steps like choreography. It felt like I was preparing for war, Not against him, but for myself. I knew he might never come looking. I knew he might not care. But I didn't want to be found. I wanted to be free. The night before I left, he came home furious because I didn't laugh at his joke in front of his friends. He called me cold, robotic, said I was killing the relationship with my attitude. I wanted to scream that he'd already murdered every part of me that mattered, but instead, I stared at him and said, "I'm just tired." And that was the truth. Bone-deep exhaustion from years of shrinking and apologizing. He scoffed and turned on the TV. He didn't see the storm brewing in my silence. He didn't know this was goodbye. At 5 a.m., I walked barefoot out of the apartment like a shadow slipping through the cracks. I left my phone on the table, screen cracked and buzzing with unread apologies that would never come. I didn't leave a note. I didn't cry. I didn't even close the door gently. I just walked toward a new life, with no name, no plan, and no expectations. Only the hope that maybe, somewhere out there, I could remember who I was before he broke me. And that someone, maybe even me, might learn to love her again. The bus ride felt like a funeral and a rebirth at once. Grief in the rear view, hope flickering on the horizon. I sat in the very back seat, hood over my head, clutching a bag that held my whole life and still felt too light. I kept my gaze on the window, watching trees blur past like years I'd wasted. The silence was different now. Not the kind he used to punish me with, but the kind that lets you breathe without fear. I didn't know what city I was headed to. I only knew it didn't have him in it. And for the first time in years, I smiled. I rented a small room above a bakery, paid in cash, and used a fake last name. The landlady didn't ask questions, just handed me the key and pointed to the stairs. The mattress creaked and the walls were stained, but it was mine. No one yelled through that door. No one called me crazy for crying. I could leave my toothbrush out, drink coffee at 2 a.m., or sleep in clothes he hated. I breathed in the smell of flour and cinnamon rising from the bakery below. It smelled like safety. It smelled like a new chapter finally beginning. I stayed hidden, like a fugitive who committed the crime of choosing herself. I walked with sunglasses, changed my hair, avoided cameras. I didn't call my friends, not because I didn't love them, but because I needed silence more than comfort. I spent hours journaling, trying to scrape his voice from my mind. "You're hard to love. You're too much. You ruin everything." His words echoed inside me like a curse I hadn't yet broken. But every morning I woke up and realized he couldn't find me here. He couldn't touch this version of me. And that was power. One day, I passed by a mirror in a thrift store and almost didn't recognize myself. My posture was taller. My eyes didn't dart around for danger. There were no new tears on my face, only healing where pain used to live. I stared for 5 full minutes, daring myself to say the words out loud. I left him. The mirror didn't break. The world didn't collapse. No one came rushing in to accuse me of betrayal. I realized in that moment, he wasn't my gravity anymore. I didn't orbit his moods. I didn't shrink to fit his comfort. I was mine again. But the peace didn't come all at once. It came in whispers and waves. Some nights I woke up expecting his anger, heart racing, hands shaking. Trauma doesn't leave just because the body runs. It lingers, attaches itself to memory like a shadow. I kept expecting a knock on the door, a phone call, a message, but it never came. And that silence, strangely, was the loudest confirmation of all. He hadn't even noticed I was gone, and somehow that hurt more than I expected. Because a part of me still wanted him to miss me, even if I didn't miss him. Weeks passed, and I began to rebuild. Not the life I had before him, but one that never included him at all. I found a job washing dishes at the bakery downstairs. It wasn't glamorous, But the warmth of the ovens and the hum of morning radio felt like therapy. The owner was kind. He asked no questions. He only said, "You work hard. That's enough." And those words, so simple, so pure, were enough to make me cry in the walk-in fridge one day. Not because I was sad, but because someone saw me as human, and didn't demand I shrink to deserve it. I started wearing colors again. Shades, he used to say, made me look childish. I bought a mustard yellow sweater and wore it like armor. I let my curls grow wild, stopped hiding them in tight buns to look presentable. I danced in the kitchen when no one watched. I hummed songs I hadn't heard in years. I began reclaiming the little pieces he'd stolen. My laugh, my appetite, my opinions. Each act of defiance was sacred. Each moment of joy was rebellion. And slowly, my soul remembered its name. Not his name. Not his girlfriend. Just me. But trauma is a tricky thief. It creeps back in when you least expect it. I started dreaming of him, of his voice calling my name, of him finding me. In those dreams I froze, helpless again, small and scared. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, hands clutching the bedsheets like a lifeline. I began sleeping with a chair against the door, just in case. I knew it was irrational, but fear isn't rational. Healing isn't linear. Some days I felt strong. Others, I couldn't even look at my reflection without hearing his voice. "You're a mess." But now I had space to fight back. I began writing letters I never planned to send. One for every time he made me feel worthless. One for every birthday he forgot, every apology he never gave. I wrote to the girl I used to be, the one who believed she deserved his cruelty. "I'm sorry I left you there," I wrote. "But I'm bringing you home now." I burned the letters in a small metal bowl on the balcony. The smoke rose like a prayer, not to be heard, but to be freed. I watched the paper turn to ash and whispered, "Never again." It felt like exorcism. It felt like rebirth. Then one afternoon, while organizing boxes, I found an old photo of us tucked in my wallet. I stared at it like it belonged to a stranger. His arm around me, my smile hollow. I tore it in half slowly, deliberately, as if separating fiction from truth. I threw his half in the trash. Mine, I kept. Not because I missed that girl, but because she survived. She endured what no one saw, carried pain that no one believed, and now she was building a life without him. She wasn't weak. She wasn't broken. She was rising. And that story wasn't over yet. The more distance I put between us, the clearer it became. I had never truly loved him. I had loved an idea, a hope, a version of him that never existed outside my desperation. I had fallen for potential, not presence. For fantasy, not reality. And that realization hit like a quiet earthquake. No explosions, no screams, just the silent crumbling of a lie I lived inside for too long. I grieved that version of him. But I no longer longed for the man who made me feel invisible in my own story. One afternoon, a stranger at the bakery asked me my name, and I hesitated. For a moment, I considered giving the fake one again. But something in me refused. I smiled and said my real name. Not the name he used to shout in anger or say through gritted teeth, but the name I whispered to myself every night in hiding. I'm still here. It felt sacred. It felt like reclaiming my voice. That moment changed something. I stopped hiding. I stopped running. I began living in my skin again. I went to a bookstore for the first time in years. Not because I needed anything, but because I could. I spent hours touching spines, smelling pages, letting the silence hold me without fear. I picked up a novel about a woman who disappeared and built a new life. I laughed quietly at the coincidence. Or maybe it wasn't coincidence at all. Maybe it was fate, winking at me through fiction. I bought the book, read it in one night, and when I closed the final page, I whispered, "Me too." And I meant it with my whole being. Still, part of me wondered if he noticed, if he searched my name, if he called my friends, if he checked the hospitals or the morgue. Part of me wanted him to panic, to feel the same terror he made me live in. But another part, the healthier part, hoped he just moved on, because I wasn't running to hurt him. I was running to find me. And that required letting go of even the fantasy that he could feel remorse. Because if he was capable of real regret, he never would have hurt me that way in the first place. One day, I caught myself singing while folding laundry. Nothing extraordinary, just an old song from childhood. But I stopped mid-verse and cried. Not because I was sad, but because I hadn't realized music was back in my life. For years, my world had been silent, muffled by his moods, his rules, his judgment. But now, melodies returned like birds after a storm. And I realized that healing doesn't come in grand gestures. It comes in small, quiet moments, like singing in safety, like breathing without fear, like remembering who you were before the world told you to be small. I began volunteering at the community center, helping teenage girls with journals and poetry. I never told them my story. I didn't need to. They saw it in my eyes, in the way I listened, in the way I handed them pens like they were weapons. "Write it down," I'd say, even if no one reads it. I watched them put their pain into words and felt something shift. Maybe survival wasn't just about escaping. Maybe it was about reaching back with your scars and saying, "I made it. You can too." That thought gave my suffering a strange, beautiful purpose. One night, I found an old voicemail from him I hadn't deleted. It had been buried deep in a forgotten app. His voice was smooth, almost kind. "Babe, stop being dramatic. You know I love you." I listened to it twice. Not because I missed him, but because I wanted to test myself. And when it ended, I didn't cry. I didn't shake. I didn't feel anything at all. Just silence. Glorious silence. That was the moment I knew. I wasn't his anymore. Not emotionally. Not mentally. Not in the smallest corner of my soul. I considered reaching out to my friends, to tell them I was safe, that I was okay. But I knew if I opened that door too early, I might get pulled back into the web. Into the questions, the sympathy, the pressure to explain. So instead, I wrote them letters I never mailed. "I'm sorry I disappeared," I wrote. "But I had to save myself before I drowned." I sealed each envelope and put them in a box under my bed. Maybe one day I'd deliver them. Maybe not. But for now, the act of writing was enough. Then came a moment I never expected. Forgiveness. Not for him. He didn't earn it. But for me. For staying too long. For loving too hard. For silencing myself in the name of peace. I stood in the mirror and whispered, "You didn't know better, but now you do." And just like that, 1,000 pounds lifted. Because shame thrives in silence. But healing begins the moment you speak kindly to yourself. And that day, I chose to treat myself like someone worth saving. Because I was. Because I am. And I don't need permission to heal anymore. People think disappearing is dramatic, that it's cruel. But they don't understand what it means to feel erased while still present. I didn't vanish to punish him. I vanished to resurrect myself. To find the version of me that danced in kitchens, laughed too loud, cried without shame. I don't regret leaving. I only regret waiting so long. But even that regret is fading now. Because I didn't just run away. I ran toward something. Toward a life that doesn't require permission. Toward a name that's mine. And every day I stay gone is another day I choose myself. I started leaving my window open at night, something I never dared to do before. Back then, every creak made me jump. Every breeze felt like danger sneaking in. But now, the wind was welcome, soft and curious, like a stranger learning my name. I slept better with that breeze, like it carried away the echoes of his voice. And for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of the dark. I wasn't afraid of the stillness. Because now, it belonged to me, and no one could take it away again. I began collecting little objects that brought me joy, things he used to mock. A teacup with flowers, a scarf too bright, a keychain shaped like a cat. He'd called them childish. I now called them sacred. Every item became a symbol of the freedom to choose, to like what I liked, to exist without shame. I placed them on my shelf like trophies, not from a war I fought, but from one I survived. They reminded me that softness is not weakness, that I didn't have to be hardened to be strong, that I was reclaiming everything. I also began documenting my days in a notebook, not to record pain, but to celebrate healing. Made tea without guilt, sang in the rain, told a stranger my real name. These weren't big victories to anyone else, but to me, they were revolutions. Each sentence was a rebellion against the silence he imposed, a declaration that I was still here, still breathing, still capable of joy. The journal became a map out of the shadows, and every page whispered, "You are not broken, you are blooming, and this time, it's just for you." Then came a moment I never expected. I met someone, not in a romantic way, not yet, but someone kind, gentle, patient. A barista who always remembered my order, who complimented my yellow scarf without irony. We talked about books, about music, about cities we'd never visited. And when I laughed, it didn't feel like a performance. It felt like a return to warmth, to human connection without fear of being judged. I wasn't in love. I wasn't even looking. But I realized something. I was ready to be seen again. That night, I stood in front of the mirror and stared into my own eyes without flinching. I asked myself a question I hadn't dared to voice before. Do you miss him? And the answer came like sunrise, gentle but undeniable. No. I didn't miss the chaos, the fear, the silence. I didn't miss explaining my worth. I didn't miss shrinking. What I missed was me. And now, I had her back, piece by piece, day by day. And no one was going to take her from me again. One morning, a letter arrived at the bakery, addressed to my old name. My heart stopped. Hands trembling, I opened it alone in the back room. It was from his sister. Just 3 lines. He's been asking about you. He's worried. If you're okay, just say something. I stared at the paper like it was poison. He was looking. Not out of love, I knew, but out of control. Not because he missed me, but because he lost his grip. And for the first time, I realized he was scared now, not me. And that shift changed everything. I didn't respond. Not because I hated him, but because I loved myself more. I didn't owe him closure. He'd had years to listen, years to care. He'd had 1,000 moments to choose me and always chose power instead. So I folded the letter, placed it in the trash, and walked away. Not in anger, in peace. The kind of peace that doesn't require explanation. The kind that comes when you finally stop performing pain for someone who never earned your tears. I had nothing left to give him, not even a reply. Later that day, I sat in the sun, letting it warm parts of me that used to live in shadow. I closed my eyes and pictured that version of me, the one who stayed, who begged, who cried quietly at night. I whispered to her, "You were so strong. You kept us alive." And I thanked her, not for staying, but for surviving. for never giving up on the tiny spark inside that someday things could be different. That spark saved us. And now, it was no longer tiny. It was fire, and I was learning how to let it burn bright without fear. I began making plans. Not escape plans, but life plans. I enrolled in night classes. I started drawing again, filling sketchbooks with color and chaos and beauty. I made a playlist of songs he used to ban and played them loud, singing with windows open. I reached out to one old friend. Just one. And when I told her I was okay, she cried. Not because I had returned, but because she had never stopped hoping I would. And that moment reminded me, healing is never just yours. It ripples, it returns, it rebuilds more than one heart. As I lay in bed that night, I whispered something I never believed I'd say. I'm proud of you. And I meant it. Proud of the girl who walked away without answers. Proud of the woman who stayed gone. Proud of every breath I took without asking permission. I didn't vanish. I didn't disappear. I rescued myself. And that's not a tragedy. That's a victory. A quiet, powerful, unshakable victory. And it's only just beginning. Some days I still feel echoes of him, like ghosts tugging at my sleeves. A word, a smell, a phrase on TV, and suddenly I'm back in that apartment, holding my breath, waiting for the next explosion. But the difference now is, I don't stay there. I breathe through it. I whisper, "You're safe now." And the ghosts fade. They always do. Because the past only has power if you feed it. And I've stopped feeding what tried to starve me. I'm learning that healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means remembering without breaking. I kept seeing the same barista. We talked more each time. He told me about his love for photography, how he captures people when they aren't looking. That's when you see who they really are, he said. I smiled and asked if he'd ever taken one of me. Not yet, he replied. And somehow that simple answer made me feel seen in a way I hadn't in years. Not watched, not judged, seen. And though I wasn't ready for love, I was finally ready for presence, for soft voices and honest laughter and spaces where I didn't need to hide. One afternoon, I passed a girl crying on a park bench. Her phone was shaking in her hand. I didn't know her, but I knew that look. Panic and silence. I sat down a few feet away and said nothing. Just stayed. After a while, she whispered, "I think he's about to hit me." My stomach dropped. I nodded slowly and replied, "Then you already know what you need to do." She looked at me like I had just handed her permission to save her own life. We didn't exchange names. But as I walked away, I knew I'd just passed the spark forward. I never became famous. I didn't publish a book or start a movement. But I became whole. And maybe that's rarer. Maybe the quiet women rebuilding their lives behind closed doors are the real heroes. Not because they escaped, but because they dared to believe they deserved better. Because they stitched themselves back together with trembling hands and still found the strength to smile again. That's power. That's rebellion. And every time I see my own reflection now, I salute the girl who disappeared and came back more alive than ever. Months passed, and one day I walked by a mirror in a store window and almost didn't recognize the woman staring back. Not because I'd changed, but because I was finally there. Fully present. No mask. No fear. I stopped, tilted my head, and smiled. She looked strong. Not in the way that fights, in the way that chooses. I waved at my own reflection like greeting an old friend. Because that's who she was. And I had missed her for so long. But now, I would never leave her again. I returned to the beach one morning, the place he once ruined for me. He used to hate the sand, the way it clung to everything, how I'd laugh running into the waves. "You're childish," he'd snap. so I stopped going. But now, standing barefoot in the surf, I reclaimed it. I let the water hit my ankles, cold and honest. I wrote my name in the sand, just mine. And when the tide came and washed it away, I didn't feel sadness. I felt peace, because I didn't need it to last forever. I just needed to know it had been real. I started posting photos again. Nothing dramatic, just flowers, books, coffee cups. Small joys, little victories, the kinds of things I used to hide because he'd roll his eyes and say, "No one cares." But now, I post them for me. Not for likes, not for attention. Just to say, I'm here, I'm alive, I'm blooming. And surprisingly, others responded. Quiet messages from women I didn't know. Thank you for sharing this. I needed that today. I hadn't told them the full story, but somehow they saw it anyway. And maybe that's all I ever needed, to be seen in the light. One night, I dreamed I was back in that apartment. But this time, I didn't flinch. I didn't cry. I packed my things calmly and walked out the door while he screamed behind me. I didn't even turn around. And when I woke up, I smiled. Because my subconscious had caught up to my soul. The girl who once begged to be loved had now outgrown the need to be understood by the one who broke her. She no longer needed revenge, answers, or closure. She had something far more powerful: freedom. The bakery offered me a promotion. I almost declined out of habit. Years of conditioning that told me I wasn't capable, wasn't enough. But I accepted. I showed up. I proved myself. And one day, as I led the morning staff meeting, I realized something. I wasn't surviving anymore. I was leading, not just others, myself, my own life, my own choices, my own story. And in that moment, I saw clearly. Disappearing wasn't the end. It was the beginning. The first brave sentence of a brand new chapter I had written with my own hands. And so, if you ask what happened to me, the answer is simple. I was a woman who cried every night until she disappeared without a trace. And in that silence, in that hiding, in that vanishing, she was found. Not by him, not by anyone else, but by herself. And now, she doesn't live in fear. She lives in color, in music, in truth. And maybe you're reading this because you're standing at the edge of your own vanishing. If you are, let me be the voice that says, you are allowed to leave. You are allowed to begin again. You are allowed to come home to yourself. The morning after I finished that letter, I felt lighter, as if the weight of years was lifting off my chest. I realized I had been carrying not just his pain but mine too, all tangled and unspoken. I stopped blaming myself for staying, for loving too hard, for trusting when I shouldn't have. Those mistakes weren't failures. They were lessons, scarred maps that led me back to myself. And now I could finally look forward without dragging the past behind me like a chain. I was free, truly free. For the first time in a long time, I looked into the mirror and saw a warrior, not a victim. The woman staring back had been broken and rebuilt with trembling hands and fierce determination. Her scars weren't signs of weakness, but badges of survival. She carried stories no one would ever know, battles no one could see, and victories too quiet for applause. But in her silence, there was power. In her scars, there was beauty. And in her story, there was hope. Hope for anyone still trapped in the dark. I stopped waiting for him to change or apologize. I stopped hoping for his recognition or regret. Because healing doesn't come from outside. It grows from inside. In the quiet moments when you choose yourself over fear, your peace over chaos, your light over darkness. I made a promise to that girl who cried in silence. You will never be invisible again. And every day since, I've kept that promise. Not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. Because I deserve to live in a world where I'm seen and loved, starting with myself. Sometimes, when the nights get quiet and the memories rise like waves, I write. I write for the girl who disappeared, for the woman who survived, for the countless others who might still be fighting to be free. I write to remind myself, and anyone listening, that no one should stay in a place that dims their light, that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is vanish, to disappear from what hurts you and reappear as the person you were always meant to be. Because in disappearance, there can be rebirth. So here I stand, not as a broken girl, but as a woman reborn from ashes and silence. I carry my story not as a burden, but as a beacon, a warning, and a hope. To anyone who's hurting, who's crying alone, who feels trapped and unseen, know this: your pain is real, your tears are valid. But so is your power to leave, to heal, to start again. You don't owe anyone your presence if they only bring you pain. You don't owe your love to those who refuse to see your worth. Disappearing was my salvation. It was the beginning of a new life where I could finally breathe, dream, and love without fear. It wasn't easy. It wasn't clean. But it was necessary. And if you're listening now, maybe it's your turn. Your turn to vanish from what hurts you and reappear whole, to write your own story with courage and grace, to choose yourself unapologetically. Because in the end, the greatest love story you can ever have is the one with yourself. Thank you for following my journey. Remember, you are not alone. And sometimes, the only way to be found is to disappear first.